Hello and welcome to The Actor and the Engineer. My name is Paul James. I am the actor.
My name is Josh Knapp. I'm the broadcast engineer.
All right, here we go, Josh.
So today we're going to talk about one of Robert Altman's first big films. It was kind of his first smash hit. He made a couple other films before this movie, but MASH, that came out in 1970, was kind of his first big success. And it's based on a 1968 book written by Richard Hooker called MASH, a novel about three army doctors. And it's a movie centering on Mobile Army Surgical Hospital. That's what that stands for. That is kind of like 3 miles from the front lines of the Korean War, and it's set in 1951. So this film is centered on the Korean War, but it's obviously a comment on the Vietnam War that was currently ongoing in 1969, 1970 when it was made and released. So you've never seen this movie before, right?
I have not,
Okay.
but now I have.
Yeah, I'd only seen it one other time, and I've obviously watched the TV show. What is your relationship with the TV show, which has obviously overshadowed this in a lot of pop culture circles?
Yeah, I watched it. It was my age range to be watching TV. Back then, you had 3 channels, and when MASH came on, you watched it. And it was an emotional ride. And I remember watching the very last episode, which was the highest rated last episode of all time. I think that's been outdone by Friends at this point, but I'm not really sure. But yeah, that show was, when you're younger and you watch TV, you don't really understand the layers to everything. You don't understand that there's a subtext. You don't understand that there's adult humor in there and farcical humor and different stuff that you just don't understand when you're a kid. But it having a serious nature taking place during a war, that part I got. But at the same time, it's not your typical TV show. Mm-hmm. So, which I could basically say about every 70s half-an-hour sitcom back in the day. Or I'm not sure, was the MASH, the TV show, an hour long? It might have been.
It's only 30 minutes long.
That's what I thought, because I thought it was considered a sitcom, which is strange because it doesn't seem like your traditional sitcom in style or anything, or in scope too. So yeah, I have a relationship with the TV show. So it's very interesting to watch this after the fact, after this being one of 100 best comedies of all time, everybody bringing this movie up when they talk about Robert Altman, because I know Robert Altman from everything but this. I've seen almost everything but this. Yeah. So that was crazy. So yeah, I have a relationship with the TV show. I have a relationship with Robert Altman, and now MASH the movie.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's going to be hard to talk about the movie without having the TV show kind of in the back of your mind for most people. But the interesting thing to think about is how audiences in 1970 experienced it. And from what it looks like, from what the box office looks like, they loved it. It was one of the top grossing films of the year. And it being a comedy was a little rare. It was nominated for multiple Academy Awards, nominated for 5 Academy Awards, and won for Best Adapted Screenplay, or whatever they called it back then. So it was seen, I think, from a critical standpoint and also from a popular standpoint as a successful movie. And I know we both keep coming back to Robert Altman, but I think that this film, it doesn't seem like it would be what it is without Robert Altman. And I'm like you. I had seen multiple other Altman films before I came to this movie. In fact, I sought out this movie because of some of the Altman films that I had seen because it was one of those whole like completionist things, even though I'm definitely not an Altman completionist, but it was one of those like, this was his big first movie, even though he did like a space movie with James Caan before this. And I mean, it's not like he was doing just like nothing before this movie. He'd been directing solidly TV shows, even like shorts and educational films and like corporate films even for 20 years. So he brings all of that experience. Plus he was a World War II veteran, and he brings all of that into this moment in time and this subject matter and this script, which from what it sounds like he kind of manipulated and allowed a lot of improvisation on the set too. And he put this thing out. So I tried to watch the film, especially the second time, from the standpoint of someone who hadn't seen the TV show and who was in this moment in time. I tried as much as I could. So I watched it with Steph, and she was off put by a lot of the crude humor and the attitudes towards women, and the attitudes in general of of the main characters, the three main characters played by Donald Sutherland, Elliot Gould, and Tom Skerritt, towards pretty much everybody else. Now, did you get any of that, or I felt like I was able to couch that into the moment in time, not necessarily like quote unquote forgiving it, but understanding what the film's goals were and where America was at that time. So how did that hit you?
Well, let's start with separating myself from the TV show. I didn't have as much of a hard time doing that because they're so distinct. The characters are so distinct in the movie and so distinct on TV. You get an understanding of who they are and how they were able to develop a sitcom from it. That was interesting to me because sometimes it's far off base, but Stalag 17 is Hogan's Heroes. So if they could take that movie and making it into a sitcom about, concentration camp or a prisoner of war camp, then I think anything's possible. So it's two different things. One is tonally a lot alike the other. The TV show is tonally like the movie, but since the characters are so different, it's just like a name thing. But I also come from the theater, so I've seen 10 Hamlets. So it's not like my friend who played Hamlet is the only Hamlet to me, and I can't watch Hamlet now so that distinction is not that big of a deal. It takes about 10 minutes. What's interesting is the opening of the movie is almost exactly like the opening of the TV show, shot by shot, actually. And so that was interesting. Yeah. And I actually, if you wanted to, at some point later on in our life as podcasters, maybe talk about TV shows that transition from movies, it would be an interesting subject because how did they get this light situational comedy out of such a kind of dark, I wouldn't say sinister, but there's an undertone to this movie because it's set at a war and stuff like that. So yes, I was able to separate it. Now, as for it being 2021 and this being 1970, it's kind of hard because they sting. When the things happen, they sting. And so I don't believe in judging something by today's standards per se, but those things did stick out to me. Sexual harassment, abuse situation, because that is really disrespectful what they did. And the worst part about that is they all line their chairs up.
Yeah. Even the other nurses were there.
And this is the character's name, Spear Chucker. As soon as they said it, I was like, oh my God, that is not good on any level. And then with the whole way that they treated women and the things that women did in this movie, here's my thing. And I know it's a bunch of men making a movie back in the 70s. So you'll see it through those eyes. I mean, if you watch anything else that Robert Altman does in that time frame, a little after, there's a movie he did called Shortcuts. There's a scene, and it's in the trailer. There's a scene where a waitress bends over and all three of the guys at the counter kind of like go to check out what she's doing bent over. Anybody does that nowadays and they would be murdered. As well, they probably should be, because that's just so disrespectful. Here's my only thing about the movie not being woke, and I don't use that term lightly. I believe in that term, and I believe that we do need to wake up to a new consciousness about where we are at with how we treat women and all of the subject matters that come up in this film. I just wish it was balanced. If you see Hot Lips Houlihan naked, then you should see one of the guys naked. Or she should have pulled the same joke on them. And it would have balanced the equation, and it wouldn't have been a sexual harassment abuse situation, because that is really disrespectful what they did. And the worst part about that is they all line their chairs up.
Yeah. Even the other nurses were there.
Yeah. Yeah. And rooting it on and all that other stuff. So it's very complex and it's definitely wrong, but I don't have major issue with separating myself for the time frame because I come from the theater and Shakespeare can be set in any time frame whatsoever. So I accept the time frame for what it is. So is it problematic? Yes. Do I think that it adds to the movie? No. Do I think that people who are 2021 influenced only are going to like this movie? No. They have to give themselves over to a different time and place. I just usually when that kind of humor is in an intellectually smart movie, it's balanced. It's balanced with the awareness that it was sexually harassing that lady. It's balanced with some kind of awareness with what that one nurse does for the dying, finger quotes, character. And then they kind of do that shot of her where she smiles. I guess that's supposed to be like she's okay with it. And
or like she really enjoyed
awkward. Yeah, which is fine. But then you counterbalance it with something else.
Yeah.
You counterbalance it with the guy waking up and saying like, well, I've had better. Something like to balance it off. I don't know how you balance that particular scene. But yeah, so it bothered me, but it didn't inhibit me from understanding why people like this movie.
Yeah, I think
that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think that this movie is centered on subversion. I mean, the whole movie is about subverting the war movie. It's about Altman and everybody else involved, their view on war and their view on the absurdity of war, and they're trying to show a totally different point of view than another film that came out that same year from 20th Century Fox, the same distribution company that made MASH, Patton. I mean, it was definitely an opposite, an anti-view of Patton. And so that I think that was their number one focus. And they didn't necessarily have their crosshairs set on religious people or people who had religion in their lives, but the Frank Burns character did have religion in his life. But what they were pointing out, I think, in the movie is that he had a veneer of piousness, and he did the exact opposite of what someone who is a real Christian would do, in my opinion. He never took blame for anything that he did. There were multiple times where he was a bad surgeon, and he was even killed someone by his negligence, and then he blamed Bud Cort, which was weird seeing him there, like a young Bud Cort, and he blamed him and ended up, you know, I mean, that was the last straw for Trapper John to, you know, that forced him, you know, that kind of essentially beat him up. But it was one of these things where it's like the main guys, you know, the guys in the swamp, they weren't doing these things to people for no reason, and they weren't randomly trying to harm people. They purposefully were attacking people who were either taking advantage of the situation, or were ignorant to the point of putting people in danger, or were just not, they just didn't have their wits about them to the point where they understood how they were affecting other people. They weren't worried about other people. And so it's interesting because there's better ways to deal with those people. And that's what we can hope for is to be respectful to everyone, but that's not how those guys did it. And at the same time, they were surgeons that were there essentially against their will. But while they were there, they tried to do as much good as they could in the way that they felt like they could do it. And so that's what I got out of it. But at the same time, they attacked Hot Lips Houlihan and Major Burns in different ways.
Yeah, absolutely.
They went after Major Burns in a you know, a man-on-man, mano-a-mano. They got Burns thrown out because he couldn't hold back his vitriol and his emotions for another person, and he ended up attacking somebody else, and that's why he got sent for a psych eval. But then for Hot Lips, they attacked her, I mean, as a female, which I thought was interesting. It's like they didn't treat them equally, even though both of them were doing the same thing.
Right. Well, they're both hypocritical.
Yeah.
If she had come in and understood that there was a way that this camp worked.
Yeah.
So she comes in and tries to be all militaristic and like there's a military code and blah, which I can appreciate that. She's technically right, 100%. So it has to do with and I don't know if Frank Burns, Robert Duvall.
Yeah, I know.
Who knew?
I was actually shocked when I saw it again.
No idea.
I don't think I realized who Robert Duvall was the first time I saw this movie. But it was a long time ago. I think it was in high school.
When his character unfolds, you kind of understand because he does have that silence inside his eyes where you're not really sure where he's coming from. When he played Boo Radley in To Kill a Mockingbird, he really says nothing, but he's frightening, but he's really not. He's very gentle in his childlike approach to things in that movie. But yet that look on his face when he's behind the door, that infamous shot of him is really scary. But that's only because we don't understand who that human being is. Yeah. So he brings that quality to all films. As for what they do to Hot Lips and, you know, the way that they give her a nickname and all that other stuff, it's an upcompeance. Is that the word? What's that word I'm looking for? Like it's
comeuppance.
Yes, thank you. Comeuppance. What'd I say? Upcompeance? Stop, reverse that. Anyway, so yeah, it's because she's being hypocritical because she hasn't adjusted. She comes right in and she just barrels through everything without finding out how things are done. And because of the intense situation, being 3 miles away from the front line, and these surgeons who are working in these terrible conditions, and they're actually, not just playing God, they are God in those situations because they have to adjust to what they are doing. And because they are able to do that, they save lives. And that's why I say they are gods in that situation. I would have preferred, and maybe if it was made in 2021, this is how it would go down. I'm not so sure that what they did to her per se is necessarily sexist, but I just think if they had showed Hawkeye or Trapper John or Duke, is that his name? Duke Forrest, Tom Skerritt. If they had shown them like being too drunk to get up to do an operation, and then she pulls something on them, then it would have read differently what they were doing. It wouldn't have seemed like they were taking advantage of her because she was a woman, or not taking advantage of her. They would be showing her her shortcomings in this situation. They eventually end up respecting her, but why do they end up respecting her?
She's a good nurse.
Because she does a good job. She's a good nurse, but she also starts to sleep with Duke. So it's maybe a little bit of both. Yeah. So I think it's a really fine line. And I agree with you 100%. This is the situation that they are in. And this is how these three guys deal with it. For right or wrong, this is how they deal with it. Burns can do whatever happens to Burns, I'm fine with, because he's a pain in the ass. So, I'll give you another example of what I'm talking about. When the guy is during the fake funeral and all that other stuff, when they actually use the term fairy, it stings a little bit because that's just not an appropriate term right nowadays. I just wish there was a balance in there. It would have been funnier to me, even in 2021, if somebody used the word fairy. I'll give you a prime example, Palm Springs. What happens in Palm Springs when the lead character can live life over and over again and there's a gay guy hitting on him the whole entire time? You have to see the movie to find out. But that's funny to me. The opposite of what you think is going to happen happens. So if the fairy term is being used, I'm okay with that. But I just wish he would have woken up and been like, Trapper John's kind of hot. Maybe him, some kind of joke to let us know that it's okay, But maybe back then it wasn't considered.
Well, I think that actually what I got from that scene was that their understanding was that the three main guys, well, specifically, I think it was Hawkeye in there. So Hawkeye in that scene was listening and was taking in what Painless was saying. And instead of him immediately saying, "You're crazy, you've never had an issue with a woman, it's not a big deal. Instead of him just shutting it down completely, he understood that Painless in that scenario wouldn't have been receptive to that input. So he was meeting that person where they were at, as opposed to trying to immediately switch their thinking. And it was a somewhat unorthodox, it was a very unorthodox way to get him to understand his situation and just a little bit more about the complexity of sexuality and all of that. And just the fact that just because, you've never had any kind of whatever performance issues and now you have, that doesn't mean that your whole life is torn asunder or whatever he thought his life would have been. It's a narrow view, and the main characters had a much wider, like they were looking at things from 30,000 feet and Painless was looking at them from the ground. And so they were figuring out a way to do it. Once again, there's a million different ways to help him through this scenario. Did they have to fake a suicide? That seems a little extreme, but once again, that's the part where I don't know where they're looking for sensationalism in this film and where they're trying to maybe just point out once again the absurdity of war. Like where does the absurdity of war fit into all of this? Where does the mindset of someone who every day, constantly, every single day is watching people come in and having to fight for them to live, and just constantly. That's the other thing that I thought was interesting about not only the movie but also the show, but we're talking about the movie right now, is that we never see the front lines. We never see the battles. We never see the heroism that is associated with, and then it is truly a part of war. There are people doing just superhuman things. We're seeing all of the bad parts. We're seeing all of the detritus from the war. We're seeing all of the parts that you don't necessarily want to see. And we're having to deal with those things, and we're having to deal with the people that deal with those things. And there are mental aspects to all of this too. And so at any moment you could just, give them a pass and say like, well, they're all dealing with a lot right now. So however they get through the day, just as long as they save as many people as they can, that's, you should let that happen. But as a famous Batman villain said, we live in a society, so we have to figure out a way to, live through that. You didn't laugh.
Yeah, I was like, come on. Josh is making a Batman reference. Don't get me started. I liked most of it. I'll leave it at that. Stay with the positive, Paul. Stay with the positive. Here's what's so interesting is tonally, it's an interesting film. MASH is tonally an interesting film because you go in there and you think you're going to deal with blood and guts and drama, and then you're like, oh, we need a clamp. We need a cut right to something fun. They never spend a lot of time.
Yeah.
I mean, it's always there. When you see a character walk into their tents and they're never alone. There's no privacy. You could throw down your tent flaps, but it's not like somebody can't stand right outside and talk, so there's no privacy. There's a realistic tone to it that I think is appropriate. But I also found that the smaller things are what made me laugh out loud. When he's talking to Painless and he's talking about performance issues, it is Donald Sutherland.
Okay.
It is Hawkeye. At least in that scene, when he first tells him what's going on. He says, oh, no, it's no big deal. That's happened to me four times. So not only is he trying to convince the guy that this has happened, but he's very specific about the amount of times that it happens. But he's also not willing to say it happened any more than 4 times. That's hilarious to me. I laughed out loud. I don't remember what happened next because I thought that was hysterical. And so there's these small moments in this film that add up to a great comedy. And I think that's what my mind focused on, because you could talk about 1970s, you can talk about 2021, the difference, but is that really the point? Because I think what you said about it being subversive and subverting our ideas of war are what's important in this film. And I'm more concerned for somebody who watches that movie in 2021 and goes, yeah, he's right. They should have pulled that 10 off that woman. And yeah, he is that because he can't have sex with women. That person worries me much more than somebody who's watching a movie and goes, that's a little sharp, but that's the 1970s and that's the humor back then. So I'm worried about that person watching a film like this and agreeing to it in 2021, regardless of what they meant back then. So tonally, I think it's really quite brilliant because it's not what you're expecting it to be. Not that this is a spoiler, but I guess it's kind of a spoiler. It's one of those movies that's on AFI's top 100 list of comedies. It's on AFI's top 200 list. It's everywhere. MASH is everywhere. So it is a film you should see. So from spoilers from now on, when a movie about a war, about medical doctors in a war, ends with a football game, that's the third chapter of this film. That's the third act of this film. When it ends with that, you can't do anything but chuckle. And my goodness gracious, Hot Lips, Sally Kellerman, she got an Oscar nomination. And when she is spewing out the things at the football game, 6 points, 6. And then they're like, they get the extra kick, or they get the kick and they get the extra point. And the guy goes, that's 1 point. And she goes, 1 point, in the same tone and cadence as it's hilarious.
It's like,
and she does it throughout we got a red flag. We got a red flag. And he's like, hooligan.
She is, I would say she's
You're an idiot.
Ignorantly exuberant. And it's like, that's just.
I love everything about her.
It is.
She has a great scene where it's just between her and Robert Duvall, where they're just eye contact and they're working on the patient. And it's an interesting comic performance to be nominated, but it does have this texture to it. It has this gravitas to it that I think is what elevated her into an Oscar nomination. But little things like, we got a red flag, and she's so excited about it. Things like that are funny to me. So when you have a movie that is intense, actually the TV show, even though we're talking about the movie, I thought was way more intense than the movie was. They don't harp on the tragedy. It's there. It's part of the issues. They're willing to change things to improve it, which is what the TV show did too. But it's not the end all be all. Okay, let's drink.
Yeah,
Everybody's drinking.
I think your tone comment is spot on, because the first time we see a surgery scene, which all the surgery scenes are fairly bloody, and I think that, they kept in probably the right amount, but not too much. But at the same time, it was enough to be, shocking. And especially the first one that you see, it's kind of one of those, like, everybody's gotten into the base, all the guys have kind of met up, and we've started getting the lay of the land, and you start feeling comfortable as an audience member. You're like, well, this isn't too bad. Like, I don't know what the big deal is. And then smash cut to, there's a bunch of bodies just splayed open. And I think that they do that throughout the film, where you're kind of, it doesn't matter where you're at in the movie, what you're feeling like in the movie. There's a left turn coming. There's something that happen at any moment. You're kind of like on sandy ground. You're not sure what's going to happen next. And I think that for me, at least, the editing, which also got an Oscar nomination, it seems like that's what was able to handle that. But I think that where it started to suffer, where the movie actually started to suffer the second time I watched it, was that I felt like it started to sprawl. Like once they get asked to go to Japan, I was kind of like, oh, okay, all right, we're just taking a complete detour, and we're going off to Japan with these two characters. And then, I mean, there's important things that happen there. In fact, there's a lot of things that are associated with children that you've got the Hojan character that they take under their wing and teach him how to make a martini. And they try to get him out of military service by giving him an upper, essentially, by giving him a drug that elevates his heart rate and makes him all agitated, and to the point where he would be 4F'd out, or whatever their version of that is in the Korean army. And so the Korean doctors see through that, and so that fails. But it just goes to show you that they're trying to protect as many people as possible, whether it's a United States Army soldier that they're doing surgery on, or whether it's someone that they've grown to know and care about. And then same thing where there was a kid who was injured while they were in Japan, and then they were trying to manage that and using facilities that were not meant to be used in that scenario. And I mean, but once again, it's like to heighten the comedy, the way that they get away with it is by getting the commanding officer and compromising physicians with a prostitute and taking pictures of him, and they're blackmailing him to keep him from telling on them. But it's not like they're trying to steal drugs or do some sort of crime. They're trying to, help someone, but the rigidity of the system is preventing them from doing that. And so they have to resort to crazy lengths to make sure that they don't get in trouble and make sure they can still work within this system, even though they're trying to not be a part of it, but be within it. So we go from that into the football scene. And I just, to me, I just felt like I would have been okay with 2.5 hours of dealing with the MASH unit itself instead of the diversions. Did that hit you at all, or did you feel like it was all a part of a whole?
Yes and no. It takes a little while to adjust to that because of my preconceived notion about what a war picture is about, and maybe because of what the TV show did. But I really let go of the TV show. I'll make reference to it, but I really let go of it. I knew that these were two different things, but there's a seriousness to the TV show, and it's there in the movie. And I kind of like the fact that that's not what the movie's main focus is. Yes, it is, but it's to make a point about, you're exactly right. They're working in a system. They're doing the right thing. They're like Robin Hood. They're stealing from the rich to give to the poor. Yes, it's theft, but it's for a good reason. And yes, they came to save this guy's life in Japan. Nobody could do it. They screwed up. They weren't going to allow them to do it. They're giving everybody a hassle. They have to skirt the system because no one's listening to them and go their own way and get it done. And what's the expression? It's better to ask for forgiveness than ask for permission. And then you see the baby, and then the thing that they do with the young boy to make sure he doesn't go into the military, even though it doesn't work really. And that's kind of a loose thread. But I'm assuming when the doctor checked him the next day that they enlisted him.
In the book, they actually have to operate on Hojan later on in the book, and he ends up passing away.
Because he gets,
So since this was a comedy, they cut that out.
That's a good moment. Well, That's you know what? That would have been something I would have debated
Yeah.
strongly to interject, because really what makes it funny is the tragedy that you're dropped into, because war is just tragic,
Mm-hmm.
and killing is tragic, and having to kill because of a reason, whatever it may be, is just tragic. I'm not making a political statement about why we were involved or why we shouldn't be involved. That's not my point. My point is that it's blood and guts. It's just tragic. So I don't know. I'm kind of glad that they went the route that they did, because in the long run, we've not really talked about the comedic moments as much as we've talked about the tragedy in this film. So it's interesting that that's really the majority of the film is a comedy, but yet we're talking about the things. We're talking about a man losing his mental stability. We're talking about the disrespect of women. We're talking about the disrespect of the military to somebody who might have a better idea. We're talking about the tragedy of the film. And then there's the larger tragedy of war and how it affects people.
Isn't there the saying that it's like you laugh so you don't cry? I mean, I think that's kind of this movie in a nutshell.
Yeah. I thought that it was a good way to go tonally.
Mm-hmm.
I was a little thrown off by the football game being so much of the third act.
Mm-hmm.
It is primarily the third act. And I was like, how are they going to end this? They're not going to end it here. If they end it here, I'll be like, I'm wondering why this movie took off. But they don't end it there. They end it where they begin, with the two characters leaving.
Yep.
And how that subtly affects people along the way. And that I like. I like big, bold things. We've talked about this a million times. The bold choice always works for me. But it is nice to see this farcical comedy that has these small moments in it. You know, when Hawkeye is saying goodbye to Trapper John, and Trapper John's like, okay, just go, just walk out, just go. You know, you got to go. It's really a way of understanding that Trapper John cannot deal with his emotions if Hawkeye stays too long, which is kind of sweet and endearing. Mm-hmm. It's kind of nice. It's a great way to say goodbye without making it mushy and melodramatic. So I can appreciate that. I can appreciate this film for what I think Robert Altman was trying to say, or at least what I took from it. But, you know, no fault to his. I'm sure the football game's in the book, but there are a lot of war pictures and prison pictures in the 70s that had to deal with football games or soccer games. It's just the way it went. So maybe it was like a trendy thing to do. But the farcical nature of having people actually have uniforms and, you know, referees and cheerleaders and the whole spiel, a whole football field in Korea during a war is crazy. So
maybe that's the point.
Yeah, maybe. Well, they say, well, football is a good American thing. It's going to make people feel like they're home again. No, no, they're bombing right over there. It's pretty much not, they're just going to be playing football in the middle of it, which in a way, the concept alone is hilarious. I mean, it's really funny that they think that they can kind of forget by doing such an American thing.
But it is a morale booster too. I mean, you can't, I mean, so you can see it both ways. Yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely. So I don't know. I think tonally he struck the right chord. I do.
All right. We're going to talk about some things that I noticed as far as how the film was made and some of the choices that Robert Altman made that you can see in his films going forward. I have not seen his previous features to this movie, but it was kind of cool seeing this movie again after doing this podcast for so long and really keying in on a lot of the stuff that we've talked about in the past. I mean, the thing that he's most known for is his complex dialogue scenes and his ensemble casts, and the fact that he has overlapping dialogue and multiple conversations going on at once and somehow is able to make it all make sense, or at the very least allow the audience to key in on potentially one of the conversations or understand where all the characters are and what they're doing, and just have a good idea of the setting of the film, even though it's a lot messier than a normal chamber piece that, you know, two people are talking in a room and that's it. So it was neat seeing that, at least, you know, whether it's people in the mess hall just talking back and forth or people around a fire or whatever, But the other things that I noticed were a lot of his, he used some longer shots, longer as in time is concerned, whereas instead of there being a single shot and then cut to another single shot, he would take a camera and have it on a tripod and follow something, whether it's a Jeep or whether it's a person moving across the camp, or even zooming in and zooming out during the same scene, which when you think about it, like zoom lenses were not used as much in, well, they weren't used as much until kind of like the, new Hollywood of the late 60s, the Bonnie and Clyde, Butch Cassidy and Sundance Kid, The Graduate. I mean, those types of movies were only 3 years old at this point when Altman was making this film, and he was utilizing those types of things. And I know that he did that in some of his subsequent films, whether it was McCabe and Mrs. Miller, or there's other films that came very quickly after that he was able to utilize those same tricks, those same camera tricks on. And so I like that too. And the other thing that I wanted to bring up was in the audio cutting, it's the first instance I can think of that is an example of an L cut, which in editing, you've got kind of your video stacked on top of your audio in an edit bay. So nowadays they would call this an L cut, where the video and the audio from one scene, they're just moving along. You see two people talking, and then the video will cut to a different scene, but the audio from that first scene will keep going. And that happened a couple times in the film, whether it was two people talking about a situation and it showing either that situation in the future, or one of the ones was just, I think it was when they were talking to the Lieutenant Colonel, Blake, and they were saying like, we need another chest spreader. And they were talking to him and the audio kept going, but then Duke and Hawkeye were kind of walking through there and surveying different things. But that's an unconventional edit. And I had not seen that very much in the past. Sometimes you would have a situation where you'd have a lead in of audio where there might be some sort of like, a lot of times a hacky version of that would be you'd have a scene and then all of a sudden you'd kind of hear this kind of like a tea whistle or a train whistle, and you hear it before you see anything, and then it'll smash cut to the train, or it'll smash cut to a close-up of the tea kettle, and it's just kind of meant to raise tension at the end of a scene, but then allow a transition into the next scene, which is a calmer scene or a different layout. So that's something that would be not necessarily be considered an L cut. That would be called like a J cut, where you hear the audio from the next scene before you get to the video. So anyway, those are some kind of cool little things that I noticed this time.
I think that's interesting because you see that a lot nowadays.
Yeah.
That's a very common thing now. So it's interesting that you noticed that didn't happen a lot in films back then, and maybe Robert Altman ushered that in. The things I noticed, because I have been watching his films and I've seen quite a few of them in the theater, to date me again, because I can't remember what the first one was. It might have been The Player. I can't remember, but I saw quite a bit before that. I went back and backtracked a lot of stuff, and I realized, I saw come back to the
Five and Dime, Jimmy Dean.
Yes. I saw that, and I didn't realize that was Altman. I saw quite a few things in his back catalog that I didn't realize I had already seen. So once I saw The Player, I started to really focus. The thing I noticed is, you know how we talk about Ang Lee and how he does not do the same movie over and over again. It's a different subject. It's different tonally. It's different atmospherically. Brokeback Mountain is not The Life of Pi, obviously. A Life of Pi is not Sense and Sensibility, obviously. But which one of these don't go with the other? All of them don't go with each other. So he's very eclectic. Ang Lee is very eclectic in his subject matters. I think Robert Altman is also, but I think the difference is there is a skeleton and a structure Robert Altman sticks to. Overlapping dialogue, many people in the cast. MASH is a little bit smaller than most. I mean, the amount of people in The Player is ridiculous, obviously, because it takes place in Hollywood and there's a lot of cameos, but they're all kind of important cameos. They work for the movie. It's not just let's put somebody in there because they're famous. You know, the example in The Player, I don't know if you've seen The Player, they go to the black and white ball and it specifically says on the invitation, you must wear black or white, and Cher comes in red.
Yeah.
I love love that. And they make it a point to go, only Cher could have gotten away with coming to the black and white ball in a red dress. So it's important. Her cameo is important. It says something about Hollywood. It says something about her disposition in Hollywood. And obviously, maybe she got away with that because she worked with Robert Altman way before. So I noticed that the structure and the skeleton of his movies are very similar. Shortcuts is very similar to Ready to Wear, is very similar to Nashville. All these multi-layered characters that just, they all intertwine, and some of them don't and some of them do, but there's lots of them, and that overlapping dialogue. And there's that long shot in The Player at the beginning. I think it's one of the longest shots in movie history, the opening sequence.
Mm-hmm. That's got a lot of zooms too.
Does it?
Oh yeah.
That actual shot or that movie?
The shot.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So, and then the ridiculousness of what people say, especially in The Player. I mean, if you listen and if you watch the trailer, they're comparing like what the movies are supposed to be. It's like these weird combinations of movies. But anyway, the point to that is that it's got this weird otherworldly dialogue that is English, and it all makes sense because you understand it. But when you really break it down, it's really nonsensical. It's very Robert Altman to do. I saw Cookie's Fortune in the theater. I saw Gosford Park in the theater, which I just recently saw again because my father had it on and I sat down and watched it. I was like, this is brilliant. So that's a murder mystery, upstairs, downstairs drama, but it's really just like Nashville. Mm-hmm. It's really just like The Player. It's really just like Shortcuts. And I was blown away by Shortcuts because I had never seen anything really like that. And that's when I really keyed into his style. So he's very eclectic in his topics that he picks, but they're very structurally the same. I would venture to say that the way he introduces characters is pretty much the same throughout his film history too. And that to me is reassuring because yes, it's a thumbprint, but at the same time, it's, you know what you're going to get, but just not in this world, if that makes sense. So I like that. I like the fact that he's sort of telling the same story over and over again, but just with a different subject matter and different characters each time. And I think that's hard to do. And he pulls it off. And if it began with MASH, then I could see how he branched out because there's a lot of things in MASH that reminded me of Ready to Wear, Shortcuts, all of the above that I've already, Gosford Park. There are things that overlapping dialogue and how it's possible to actually understand the key plot points while they're doing that overlapping dialogue is because Robert Altman knows how to make the shot work. So it might be all of this utensils and napkins and Mrs. does this and Mrs. wants that and Mr. wants this and they're going hunting on this day in Gosford Park. And then, but you hear what you're supposed to hear that promotes the narrative to move forward. That I think is hard to do. And he does it brilliantly. I think that's why he's celebrated as a director because he really does have a firm hand on that.
And he also is kind of the inspiration, I think, for a lot of other filmmakers who came after him. I mean, if you just look at like Richard Linklater or Paul Thomas Anderson, those guys, they kind of like put their flag in the ground as far as, Dazed and Confused or Slacker for Richard Linklater. And then also you've got Magnolia and Boogie Nights. I mean, those are huge films with big casts that you have to kind of manage all of these pieces. And it makes you wonder if they used a lot of these Altman films as roadmaps to success for a movie like Dazed and Confused or Boogie Nights. Because how do you handle 20 characters? Like, how do you give each character enough screen time, enough character development? Is somebody going to get lost in the shuffle? And if so, do you just cut them out? Those are the kinds of questions that you need to ask. And it's interesting to see the kind of later relationship between Paul Thomas Anderson and Robert Altman later on in his life. Essentially his last film that he directed was Prairie Home Companion, and it was pretty much half directed, or it was assisted by Paul Thomas Anderson. In fact, that was the only way that he could make that film, is if the studio was able to secure PTA as the on-deck director. And so, and I don't know, from what I've read about that whole situation is that Robert Altman didn't even necessarily get up or couldn't really physically like get up and go and talk to the actors. So you've got P.T. Anderson is like his gopher. Altman sitting there and being like, hey, you really need to go tell whoever it is, you really need to go tell them.
Meryl Streep.
Yeah,
She's
that she
out
needs
of
to.
tune in that one scene. She's a little flat on that minor A.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
And so PTA is like, yeah, let me go do that real quick. So yeah, it's that kind of stuff. But also, I'm sure it was just an amazing learning experience for him, and I'm sure he absolutely loved it. But still, it's not even what necessarily he just did in MASH in 1970. We get to see the benefits of those ripple effects in films that are even being made today. So that's the cool stuff.
Yeah, and I think that if anybody is going to be able to speak for Robert Altman, Paul Thomas Anderson makes the most sense to me. And Richard Linklater, it's like Robert Altman had babies, and that's who he had, because really that kind of easygoing style, just everyday stuff that Richard Linklater does is very much what Altman does in a lot of his films. But that also kinetic kind of crazy energy and all those cast members talking on top of each other. I just recently saw Magnolia again for the umpteenth time. What a movie.
Yeah.
My God. Every time I come out of that movie, I'm like, God, that's good. Man, that is spectacular. But it is crazy, and it's just that much further past the envelope that Robert Altman has opened up. So I think that Paul Thomas Anderson has just taken what Altman has done and now started to do it in a modern day frame of mind. And he's just extended that thing. So that makes perfect sense to me. And I really don't honestly think anybody working on Prairie Home Companion would be upset about that, because that choice makes sense.
Oh, definitely.
It just makes sense.
I've got a question about P.T. Anderson, especially since you've just seen Magnolia. So do you feel like, after seeing Magnolia, do you feel like there's a difference between, because I used to have kind of like a view of like, well, Paul Thomas Anderson is Paul Thomas Anderson, and he's just been that his whole career. But I feel like if you compare Magnolia to The Phantom Thread, that I feel like, even though that's the same direction, I can see aspects of that person in both of those films. It seems like he's really come into his own and kind of like narrowed his focus in a movie like Phantom Thread versus Magnolia or even Boogie Nights, whereas he may have borrowed a lot more from Robert Altman earlier on in his career. I mean, not just Robert Altman, Martin Scorsese, like his use of music is just amazing in those films. And it's not, he wasn't the first one to think about using a classic rock song in a particular scenario. That's not something that is new, but his ability to kind of like pick and choose the greatest hits from other filmmakers that he loves in those earlier films, I think that over time, the 20 years subsequent to that, he was able to kind of refine and get to a point where he's making something that's completely unique. And I think it ultimately started with There Will Be Blood, but just seeing subsequent films, even Inherent Vice to a certain extent, but really Phantom Thread to me was kind of like, whoa, this is a totally different dude.
Well, I think the subject matter and the narrative of the film is what dictates that.
Yeah.
So do I think that he's trying to make a comedy in Inherent Vice and do it like Magnolia? Yes, I do. Because that is just like epic and just filled with people and dialogue, and it's a bit much for me. I have to see it again. The Master is another good example. The Master is kind of like the perfect combination between Punch Drunk Love, Magnolia, and There Will Be Blood. There's an intensity to The Master, but there is a kinetic craziness to Magnolia that The Master has too. But there's a subtlety to The Master that Phantom Thread has. So I think, yes, everybody borrows from everybody. Every artist is a cannibal. Every poet is a thief. I believe all that. And I believe that you do, imitation is the highest form of flattery. And when you want to express something, how something affected you is going to come back out. It's just the way that it is. So if he was affected by Robert Altman films or Scorsese or Spielberg or whoever it may be, that's going to come back out. Just like Tarantino. We've talked about this a couple times before with both of these directors. They are who they are because they are a sum total of what they've learned. But the thing that sets Tarantino and Paul Thomas Anderson apart from most people, in my opinion, is that they made it their own. Yes, Tarantino is literally ripping off shot by shot from some old movie that only he knows about.
But he's willing to tell everybody he's ripping it off. He doesn't. He's homaging it. He's okay with that.
Yeah, he's putting his thumbprint on it. He's making it okay. And because he does that, Django Unchained works with the modern day music versus, like that would be jarring in anybody else's films. But because we have come to understand, and you know what, even if I didn't know Django Unchained was a Tarantino film, I still would have dug it because it seemed to work for what it meant to be. And so, yes, they're influenced by all these directors, but they made it their own. So yes, I do believe what you're saying is that Paul Thomas Anderson has grown as an artist and Phantom Thread is showing his maturity. I am convinced, though, that if something Magnolia Boogie Nights-esque comes up, he'll be able to do that too.
Well, his movie this year is Soggy Bottom, that is set in the 70s, and it's a coming-of-age film set in the San Fernando Valley in the 70s. And Philip Seymour Hoffman's son is playing the lead role in it, and it's coming out on Christmas. So he's going to kind of go back into the 70s era and kind of go back into the San Fernando Valley, which is where he was in Boogie Nights and Magnolia.
Well, the thing that's interesting about Phantom Thread in the conversation we're having about MASH is Robert Altman did a fashion movie called Ready to Wear. I made reference to it earlier. So that is what Paul Thomas Anderson would have made if that's what his focus was on the whole fashion industry and the whole runway industry and all that other stuff. But that's not what Phantom Thread was about. The movie's called Phantom Thread. It's one thread, It's how complex making a dress can be and how it is an artistry and how that can have a psychological effect on somebody who has a complex that's borderlining perfectionism. Not borderlining, I was trying to be nice.
Oh,
it is perfectionism. And it is about whether or not you can achieve that. And can you achieve that without other people's help? So if he was to make that crazy like Magnolia or crazy like Shortcuts or anything Robert Altman did with his big, large casts, it wouldn't be appropriate for the subject matter. So I don't know. Yes, I believe Paul Thomas Anderson has matured, but I think that's part of who he is that crazy energy with all of those people. That Julianne Moore scene in Magnolia in the pharmacy, that is just quintessential. The Julianne Moore scene with Skater Girl in Boogie Nights, where they do nothing but stay in the one room and talk about like leaving and doing stuff while they're snorting them. Right. That whole tough. So if he did something like that in Phantom Thread, it wouldn't have been appropriate for that subject matter. So yes, I think he matured, but I think he is. I'm not going to be surprised if the next one is as crazy. So,
well, yeah, I mean, it will be interesting to see that, but at least we do have that to look forward to this year, another Paul Thomas Anderson movie. So that's good. I know we got off on a PTA tangent, but it was still tangentially involved in the Robert Altman discussion.
No, I think Robert Altman is an important director. I'm surprised it's taken us 6, almost 7 years to get to him.
Yeah.
Because I don't even know if we made reference to him. I mean, I'm sure we have. I'm sure.
I'm sure we have at some point.
No, I'm not.
Yeah.
So it doesn't mean any disrespect because he really is an important director and he is an important filmmaker. And it's something people need to explore because it's not being done like that anymore. These big casts are not being done. And usually it's not, usually it's a mess, usually a studio has an influence on it and it doesn't come out the way that these films, I think they're poignant. I think the subject matters are important. I think if you want to understand Hollywood and never go to Hollywood, you can watch The Player. I think you can understand Nashville and music and what music might be like by watching Nashville. Shortcuts, I'm not exactly sure what you're supposed to take from that. But so I think he's an important filmmaker. So I just wanted to make sure I said that again.
Yeah, there are directors who do try to get a lot of people together. And one of them is Steven Soderbergh, and he's done it in the past, especially with the Ocean's movies. But yeah, I mean, he's actually got another movie coming out too. So it'll be interesting to see. I'm kind of excited about movies this year because there's a backlog of movies from last year, plus all of the movies that are being developed this year. I mean, I was just looking at the cast for his new movie, No Sudden Move. You've got Matt Damon, John Hamm, David Harbour, Benicio del Toro, Don Cheadle, Ray Liotta, Amy Seimetz, Miranda Richardson, Bill Duke, Brendan Fraser, so Noah Jupe. That's a lot of people. We'll see what happens.
I like all of them.
I know, right? Well, you can check us out on the web at Actor and Engineer. You can find us on Twitter at Actor Engineer. We're on Facebook at facebook.com/Actor and Engineer. And you can also find us on YouTube. Just search for Actor and Engineer Podcast. And we'll see you next time.